I want to thank the Israel Policy Forum for hosting this conversation and for your consistent, principled approach towards Israel and the U.S. Israel relationship. As we settle into our own new presidency, and Israel seems on the cusp of settling into its own new political reality, which at the time of this recording looks like potentially a new government, I believe it's critically important to look forward, but also to remind ourselves of what has always driven the U.S. Israel relationship. Because the fact is, the U.S. Israel relationship and security of the Israeli people is much more important than any one person. It transcends faith, party affiliation, and political philosophy. Our relationship is rooted in shared democratic values and a shared interest in promoting peace and stability for Israel, its neighbors, and the whole region, in protecting and defending a Jewish and democratic state where all people can live in freedom and dignity. It remains my deepest belief, as I know it does for IPF as well, that Israel's long term stability and viability is best secured by Israelis and Palestinians negotiating a two-state agreement that provides for the safety, dignity, and peace of all people. I also believe that the United States can and should continue to play a role in helping to facilitate that outcome. However, history has reminded us many times over that we cannot force that ultimate goal. And unfortunately, the most recent round of tragic violence has reminded us that however small their faction may be, the actors who actively do not want this outcome are willing to use varying degrees of violence to promote their own agendas and make a sustainable, peaceful outcome all the more difficult. But let me be clear. In the face of a terrorist organization committed to Israel's destruction, willing to indiscriminately attack civilians and put others directly in harm's way, Israel has every right to defend herself and her population. Full stop. As rockets fly and civilians tragically die, we see emotions rise and rancor grow. Political actors across the region, in the United States and even the United Nations, trying to capitalize on a truly dangerous and tragic situation for narrow political gains. So, for those of us who truly care about the long term viability of a Jewish and democratic Israel and a strong U.S. Israel relationship rooted across the American political spectrum, I believe we need to focus on three overarching elements. First, we must push back against all efforts to use the U.S. Israel relationship for partisan politics. The very moment Hamas launches a barrage of rockets into Israeli civilian centers, inviting a response they know may impact civilians in Gaza, is not the moment to call for a slowing down of U.S. security assistance to Israel. Halting or conditioning aid is not only illogical, it threatens to put Israeli and Palestinian civilians more at risk. Similarly, calls to withhold assistance to Palestinians that Congress has authorized and appropriated in full compliance with all applicable laws, including the Taylor Force Act, does not do much to advance the cause of peace on the ground and gives us less of an entry point. And on the global stage, we must continue to push back against lopsided and misguided efforts to isolate, undermine, or delegitimize Israel. That means stopping BDS from seeping into completely unrelated conversations. And among all the crises the world faces, including an ongoing global pandemic, we cannot stand silently when international institutions continue to single out Israel. It's ludicrous, offensive, and does nothing to advance peace. Second, we have to continue the hard work of diplomacy, including engaging more productively with Palestinians. The previous administration's cutoff of assistance led to a shutoff of political engagement, but did nothing to address core concerns or empower any Palestinians willing to work for the cause of peace. If we are not at the table, we simply don't have the ability to push for the kinds of reforms I believe we should be encouraging, including ending the martyr payment system and reforms at UNRWA. We should also seek to build on the Abraham Accords and encourage more countries in the region to publicly embrace Israel on the world stage. We should help encourage and foster these relationships to promote a more sustainable peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Because while these new partnerships are unequivocally good, neither the Emiratis nor the Moroccans were previously lobbying rockets into Jerusalem. To be clear, our diplomatic efforts must continue to be grounded in protecting the interests of Israel, the region, and the national security interests of the United States. That is why, even though I applaud the last administration for building on years of quiet diplomacy, I strongly believe these kinds of agreements should not be rewarded with advanced U.S. weapons systems that potentially threaten both Israel's qualitative military edge and U.S. national security interests, unless they meet all the measurements of U.S. national security interests that we establish in considering arms sales. Finally, we must overall continue to be a reliable and honest friend to Israel and do what friends do: stand by them when they are under attack and speak the truth. We must find the nuance. We are capable of doing so, and we owe it to our own values and the values that form the basis of that friendship. So let's be grounded. Our values and interests will continue to drive the ironclad U.S.-Israel relationship. This does not mean that the president should call a high-level peace summit tomorrow. It's become painfully clear over the many decades, indeed centuries, of various iterations of conflict over this land that leadership matters. The United States cannot will peace into existence, nor convince any political leader to do more than they are willing or able to do. We can, however, continue to support those voices who drive those foundational values of this relationship. Thanks in part to the advocacy of IPF, the Alliance for Middle East Peace, and other advocates, Congress passed the bipartisan Nita Lowey Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, which, as you know, authorizes significant funds to support Israelis and Palestinians who are willing to do the hard work through business, people-to-people engagement, and peace building. At this moment, we must find ways to empower those who continue to work towards cooperation and a two-state solution. While the big decisions about the fate of Israelis and Palestinians will be driven by high-profile political acts of courage, the people making those choices will be driven by the people they represent. So now, let us focus on building up those voices who want to work in support of peace, who want to work in support of prosperity, those people who are willing to do the hard work. It is said that he who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is not fit for the kingdom of God. Let us put our hand to the plow and look forward to the hard work of accomplishing peace with security, prosperity, and a brighter future. And with that in mind, thank you for all your ongoing efforts. Shalom.